We got to talk about that, and because we're live,
Absolutely.
right? Are we live?
I think we're live, aren't we?
Are we live? We're live. Yes, we're live.
Yes,
Hello.
you are.
Super. Okay, well, welcome everybody to this panel on researching the Golden Age. I'm very glad to be with you in Columbus, Ohio, except that I am in the small village of Oud-Heverlee in Belgium, about 15 miles to the east of Brussels, which is where I live. With us, we've got Farah Mendelssohn, who is sitting, I think, in the British West Midlands, in Stoke-on-Trent, where much pottery comes from. Farah is the author of The Pleasant Profession of Robert A. Heinlein, which is a jolly, jolly good biography of Robert A. Heinlein and of his context and relevance to the science fiction world and the world of his time. Indeed, a full-on analysis. Farah, I'll get you to describe the book. I think that's probably the easiest. Alec is the author of Astounding, the story of, let me get them in the right order, Campbell, Asimov, Heinlein, and L. Ron Hubbard, and the Golden Age of Science Fiction. Thank you. These books were both Hugo finalists. Alex was a finalist last year when I was the Hugo administrator. Farah's was a finalist this year when I was the deputy Hugo administrator. Unfortunately, neither of them won. I only count the votes, so I don't decide who wins. But it was a jolly good list both years, and those books were jolly good things to have on them. So maybe, Farah, if you want to introduce yourself a little bit, but the book a bit more, and I'm going to ask each of you to say a bit about the book before we get on to the meat.
Okay, so first of all, it's not a biography. It does have a biographical chapter, but I lifted that wholesale from Bill Patterson, plus a few other bits and pieces. I took his 2 volumes and brought that down to about 10,000 words, which I suspect was a service in and of itself.
Yes. I mean, that book is great, but I am very happy that the short version also exists.
Exactly. Yeah. So my book actually started as a commission for Illinois University Press for a 65,000 word introduction to the works of Robert Heinlein. Only the first draft came out at 180,000 words. And after lengthy discussions, which included a proposal to split the book into 2 books, one for fans and one for academics, which struck me as an interesting idea, we parted on very good company. I do want to make that clear, that there was no resentment on either side, and it went to Unbound. And essentially, it was an attempt to take Heinlein on his own terms, to look at his work very much in the order in which it was written and published, and to look at the arguments across all the texts, because what I'd become increasingly aware of through online discussion was that whenever I got into a discussion about Heinlein, I tended to find myself dealing with 2 quite distinct demographics. One group fairly right-wing who'd read one set of books, one group fairly left-wing who'd read another, and a tiny number of people who'd actually read them all. And what I forgot to say is that this actually started out as part of my undergraduate dissertation. And as early then, I'd found myself really struggling with what the critics were saying about Heinlein, which often just did not match with what I was seeing on the page. So those were those things going on. The early genesis is something we can maybe talk about earlier when we get to why Heinlein in the first place. Over to Alec.
Yeah, no, I mean, your book is fantastic. And it certainly, as you said, it fills a need that was there for someone to just kind of read the whole corpus and kind of be able to talk about it in a fairly objective way, which I think you did wonderfully. So thank you. And it made me feel better because it's one of the things that my book does not talk as much about, because my book is a biography of 4 people, and it ended up being a huge book, bigger than anyone expected, which forced me to cut a lot of the literary analysis and discussion of the stories that I would have loved to include, but there just wasn't room. And I kind of had to make the tough call that it was the biographical stuff that had not been published before that was more valuable. Because the way this book evolved is a little bit different. So my background is more of a novelist and a science fiction writer for short fiction. And I had initially wanted to write basically like a literary analysis of Astounding magazine. I thought I was going to go through and read 30 plus years of Astounding and Analog and kind of do a where did we go, where did we come from, where are we going sort of take on that magazine. and which would have been a great book for someone to write someday. But what happened is that,
me.
you know, that would, I mean, I would love to
We'll
see
talk
it.
about
I
that.
mean, it would be awesome. It would be awesome. But within a day of looking into this as a potential book project, I realized that there had never been a biography of John W. Campbell, which I still think is remarkable. I mean, even now, I'm stunned that that was available for someone to grab. And I was like, I'm going to grab it because it is a great subject. He is obviously worthy of a big biography. And so I kind of unexpectedly became a biographer because, you know, this project was there. And it was pitched to a mainstream publisher. And one issue that came up very early on is that Campbell, while clearly a significant name within science fiction, is not a household name. And I was asked, are there other writers you could add to this story to make it a group biography, you know, 3 or 4 people? And I said, I've got, you know, Isaac Asimov, possibly the most famous science fiction writer in America, Heinlein, maybe the most influential, and L. Ron Hubbard. And these are the obvious names that kind of fall into that net when you expand that circle outward from Campbell. And my editor said, that sounds great. And so 2.5 years later, I had this massive biography that, you know, kind of came, it arose organically from my interest in science fiction and trying to figure out like what had not been covered in the nonfiction books that were already out there. And so it really was my attempt to kind of fill a really obvious need that I knew would be an important book if I did it right. And and I was lucky to be able to claim it.
Because can I just respond briefly? So first of all, this is a mutual admiration club for those in the audience who don't know that. I think it's an amazing book, but I was on tenterhooks when it was due out because I wasn't sure how much I was going to have to revise of my own book when A Standing came out. And I think there was like a month between your book coming out and me having to submit. It was very, very tight. And I was fairly relieved I didn't have to revise anything about Heinlein, but it was really interesting to be able to nail down things about Heinlein's interaction with Campbell, which I hadn't been able to nail down before. And that was fascinating. Yeah,
I mean, every nonfiction book, I think, is kind of in secret dialogue with previous books that have been written in a way that most readers aren't really aware of. And in my case, Bill Patterson's Heinlein biography was the obvious kind of elephant in the room because it's a 2-volume biography of Heinlein that does cover his life in insane detail, like almost like on a weekly basis. And you know, it is a massively useful book. It does have a lot of shortcomings, especially when it comes to interpretation. And Patterson's, you know, he was a Heinlein fan, and he takes Heinlein's side, and he and other players in that story suffer as a result. And so I knew that I'm not going to find a lot of new stuff about Heinlein just from his archives, which Bill Patterson had massively, exhaustively researched. But what I could do is bring out things that he did not discuss. And you know, among them was Campbell's influence on Heinlein, which Patterson was inclined to downplay. So if that was what you found in my book that added to your knowledge of Heinlein, you know, that was not an accident. That was kind of what I deliberately set out to provide, to supplement, you know, this, for the sake of the ideal reader who had read Patterson's book and was going to say, okay, I know all this stuff, so show me what you've got.
And I think that that's actually a key thing. I don't want to diss Patterson, but the book is boring. There's no way around it. And it's boring because he's assembling the material without ever really asking, why is this incident important? I mean, for those who've not read it, if Patterson could have told us where Heinlein did his laundry, he would have done.
I mean, he might have. It was 3 volumes originally, and it was cut down by David Hartwell.
Thank goodness.
I mean, from what I hear, was a very difficult process.
But what's quite noticeable is the degree to which Alec and I both actually picked up on specific things. One I noticed today is that we both picked up that Heinlein being out of the country when McCarthy was running his campaign may actually have been crucial in Heinlein failing to understand what was going on. That is something I talk about a lot, that his lack of understanding that he didn't always have all the facts. Both of us seem to have picked that as a turning point. Whereas when you read Patterson, partially because Patterson is at times imposing his own politics on Heinlein, he sees it as a much more seamless effect.
I think also Patterson is much less interested in context. And
Yes.
for him, it's content rather than context.
Well, one thing I like about your book is that it's written by someone who clearly has read things besides Heinlein. Has knowledge of the world that was not exclusively gained through Heinlein, which is not true of a lot of Heinlein fandom, or at least not obvious. And so that kind of context, the idea that there is a world elsewhere, is actually kind of rare in science fiction, nonfiction. And so I really appreciate that when I see it.
I'd say that the key text I really loved is H. Bruce Franklin's book War Stars, which is superb. The narrowest focused, but in some ways the best critical reader was the last book, the one by Leon Stover, which, although I have issues with it, really does try to read what's on the page. The interesting thing is that the weakest is by the person who was my mentor. Now, he wasn't alive to be my mentor on the actual project, but part of the reason I ended up wanting to write a book on Heinlein was a rather right-wing academic called George Slusser, who I met when I was working on what was supposed to be my PhD, which is a study of American science fiction in the magazines. So please let me come back to it. Please don't poach. I do want to write that book.
Please take it. It's all yours.
Oh, I loved it. I must be one of the only people to come back to something Nicholas said in the green room. I think I'm the only person under 70 who has actually read every science fiction magazine published between 1929 and 1945. And I really have.
Which takes us on to the question I was going to ask you both next. I mean, we've talked about why you wrote the book. Can we talk a little bit about how you wrote the books? And I think Alec first, because I think this was your first non-fiction book, wasn't it? Whereas for Farah has written several. So I think from your point of view, it'd be interesting to hear what was different for you about this kind of writing, and from Farah, what was different about this particular writing.
Can I drop something in just before Alex starts? It's interesting, neither of us are in literature, and I think that's something we should both pick up on. You have your degrees in classics.
That's right. Yeah, so I mean, I certainly had experience in academic writing, in sort of exegetical kind of close analysis. So, I have some of those skills, but certainly writing a biography, I had to kind of figure out how to do it as I went along. And there's a line from a David Mamet movie called Heist that I always think about, where Gene Hackman says, I try to think of a fella smarter than myself, and then I asked, what would he do? And so I thought, what would a good biographer do? If I were a good biographer, how would I approach someone like Campbell? And the funny thing is that when you look at a lot of science fiction biographies, they do not do some of the things that you would kind of expect biographies to do, like read letters, go back to primary sources, don't rely solely on someone's recollections. Don't take anecdotes at face value. There's a lot of mythology in science fiction that falls apart when you look at it more closely. So I was like, okay, so are there archives? Are there things I can look at? And luckily, I would never have even pitched this idea in the first place if it weren't for the Heinlein archives, because they are available online. Thousands and thousands of letters and other documents have been scanned. You can get them, you can pay a small fee to get them as PDFs. I was lucky enough to get sort of like a scholarship or fellowship through the Heinlein Trust that gave me like a coupon code so I could download all the stuff I wanted. But the fact that it was out there, and this trove of material was there for me to look at no matter what, kind of gave me the courage to proceed, because I knew at the very least there was a ton on Heinlein and Campbell that I could look at and kind of fall back on if my other avenues of exploration dried up. There was also a lot of Campbell correspondence out there. A fan named Perry Chapdelaine had gone to Campbell's widow probably in the 70s and bought the rights to all those letters. And Chapdelaine's kind of like an interesting guy. He passed away while I was writing this project, but he put out like 3 or 4 volumes of these letters, and they were very interesting. And I was like, okay, are there more letters? And I found out that they had all been microfilmed, and there were microfilm reels available at the Library of Congress. And so I got the microfilm reels. I kind of semi-clandestinely had them scanned and turned to PDFs. And then I just, read thousands of letters. And again, it's like, what would a biographer do? I looked at every page. I said, I don't want someone else coming along 10 years from now or 5 years from now who is more thorough than I am, who will read stuff that I obviously should have been reading. And so I always have this kind of ideal, nitpicky, obsessive reader at the back of my head who actually exists. If you're a science fiction fan, you know that this is actually your core audience. And so, I had to prepare for the nitpickiest, most obsessive people to look at this book and say, oh, well, this date's wrong, and you didn't talk about this essay from, fantasy and science fiction in 1956, and so I had to kind of like think very almost like a paranoid way about, what will I forget to do that will come back to haunt me later on. And that's kind of been the rule that I followed when it comes to doing this kind of research.
Yeah. Farah.
Oh, so as I said, mine started as a commission. So the structure of the book is very much what Illinois wanted as the structure of the book, but it went wrong quite early on. I was under pressure by Illinois to send in a proposal, and I did. And the feedback came back that it was too ordinary. And I said, that's fine, but in order to challenge this structure, I'm going to have to read Heinlein from scratch. And if I start reading Heinlein from scratch, I am effectively writing the book, but you won't have accepted it yet. And part of the reason I was able to walk away from the agreement is that we actually had a gentle person's handshake on it. I'd not signed a contract. So it was never intended to be archive work, something for which I'm actually quite envious. And I had to stop myself going down that rabbit hole, because if I'd have gone down the rabbit hole of archive work, we'd still be writing it. So I literally did the thing of reading everything absolutely religiously in order of publication. And in one or two cases, having to decide, so which version of something am I going to use? So for example, a slightly controversial one is I used the uncut version of Stranger in a Strange Land, because it actually does make more sense than the first edition. It really does. The book holds together much better. And what I ended up with was a whiteboard full of connections where I was trying to chase themes down. And my notes are, so I used a program called EndNote. So I was constantly keywording entries as I created each section, each index card effectively. As I saw the connections of an idea or a character, or when a theme turned up. One of the things I did, for example, is I kept track of how many times cannibalism was used as a reference, because I knew I was going to need that for Farnham's Freehold, although I still ended up having to get a French check. And one of the things I did, and I've done this before, is I blogged constantly. And that was actually helpful, because I got challenges and reminders and comments from other ardent Heinlein fans who wanted the book to be as conversational as I wanted it to be. Yeah. But the other thing I did, which really developed out of Rhetorics of Fantasy, was I really wanted to think about how Heinlein wrote, what his words on the page looked like. Because the thing I kept coming across over and over again, and it stems from the New Weird, and I'm sorry, but I really do condemn New Weird writers for this, is that they were classically like 1920s artists dismissing the Victorians as a load of over-elaborate rubbish. Yet they needed to make their claim for artistry by dismissing what came before. Yeah. And one of the ways they had done that was by dismissing the artistry of non-New Weird writers. And I'm putting it that way because a surprising number of feminist writers get dismissed by New Weird writers as well. People like Michael Moorcock just don't seem to have read The Feminist. Sorry, I'm deviating. And I wanted to make an argument, which I did at great length in the end, that Heinlein was actually a rather skilled author, that I don't want to claim him for literature, because that would be inappropriate. But no, he was doing deliberate things with the language he chose. Mm-hmm. This isn't lazy writing. This isn't pulp writing. Yeah. And part of the defense of that is how he changes his style according to what he's trying to achieve. Yeah. So I spent a lot of time with like arrows pointing at my notes, connecting things and sorting things into sections. And even the very last go through, my partner, Edward James, was still suggesting to me, this might work better here. And I will mention his name a few times because he copy edits all my books. But on this book, he actually got an editorial credit because he did genuine editorial work on it.
Yeah, yeah. You mentioned dismissing what has gone before, and I'm going to deviate the conversation a little bit before we open up to questions. Sitting with the Hugo administration, both last year and this, the question of the Retro Hugos and what they're actually for, and how best to commemorate the writing of former days today, has been very close to the top of my mind. And I would be interested to know what you two think about this, having, first of all, been Hugo finalists yourselves, and also having engaged much more closely with the science fiction of 75 years ago than probably most of the people who are commentating on it. Farah first.
I'm not quite sure what you've just asked me. The
What do you think
is a
of
bit
Retro
tangled.
Hugos?
So what do I think of
Retro Hugos?
Oh, they're awful. They were a lovely, nice idea when they first came out, but they're tending to double down. The only times they tend to be interesting is when the nominating and voting body are outside the UK, sorry, or outside the USA, and have a slightly different take on them. This is tricky. I said at the beginning of my own book on Heinlein, just because I love Heinlein doesn't mean anybody else has to read it. It doesn't mean anybody else has to love it. And the Retro Hugos seem to be demanding that people love stuff. And I have a problem with that. I'm not keen.
Alec.
Well, okay, so I feel like I'm one step removed from the sort of fan discussion about the Retro Hugos, so I'm not going to weigh in too much on that. But speaking personally, I value it for the ballot. I think the winner is almost foreordained each year because it has to be the story that people actually remember, which, when you're talking about stories that were written decades ago, over half a century ago, it's usually pretty clear which authors and certainly which editor, just to say, Campbell is going to keep winning Retro Hugos. And it's only because, it's partially deserved. I think you can't argue with his importance circa 1945, but he's also the one guy who is going to have enough name recognition from that period until you get to like the Galaxy and fantasy and science fiction era, to win Hugos. So I kind of like mentally disregard the winner each year because I know it's not really relevant or it's not reflective of quality. But when you look at the ballot, I always find stories I haven't heard of, and I see authors, and especially on the fan side, things that I know I should know more about, or just sort of want to know more about. And so, as just a guide for further reading, I think the Retro Hugos have value. And it's, I don't know how many people actually do this, systematically seek out the stories on the ballot and try to read as many as possible. But I've done it a couple of times. I've always found stuff that I enjoy. And, for example, like this year, I think for best novella or novelette, Catherine Moore's No Woman Born was on the ballot, which I think is a fantastic story that would, benefit from more attention. And if like 10 people read that story because it ended up on the Retro Hugo ballot, then that's a win. It's a modest win, but I think that also deserves to be recognized.
And certainly you and I are two of them, yeah.
Okay. I was going to say, first of all, that story has been endlessly anthologized, so it's hardly disappeared. But also, this comes back to the dissing previous generations. I'd be happier if the Retro Hugos were actually rewarding stories of the pre-Campbell generation, because one of the things Campbell did to establish his reputation was to dismiss the incredibly good stories of the 1930s. And there's some fascinating stories, far more left-wing, far more socially radical, often with far more feminist content from both men and women. Still a big problem with race, because the progressives of the period were extremely racist. But we hardly ever look at that. So for me, the retros, as I said, they tend to double down on the emphasis on that period.
Yeah. I think I'd like to ask people watching if they've got any questions. And just to remind you, the way to ask a question is to put it in the Discord, and then our wonderful staff will transfer it to the Zoom chat, which we're all looking at. We've been prohibited from looking at the Discord chat. So if you put rude stuff there, we won't see it until after the end of the panel. Comment from Carl Johan Noren to Alec's point, saying that the issue regarding winners is even more prevalent in the nomination stage. I must say, having had the immense pleasure or not of grinding through the nomination votes both last year and this, I think that's absolutely true. And to me, one of the frustrating things is the good stuff gets overlooked. I mean, iRocket, which won this year, It's not the best short story of 1944. It's not even the best Bradbury short story of 1944. But The Lake didn't make the threshold, and I, Rocket did. So unfortunately, that's the way it goes sometimes. Waiting for more. Question. Right. Where is the book on Arthur C. Clarke?
Okay, well,
I can tell you that.
There is a book. There's a book on Clarke.
No, which one is that one that you're looking at? There's a new one out as well.
Well, this is Visionary by Neil McAleer, and you're probably thinking of is it this one? Sorry, I got them all here. So,
no, there's a new one.
Are we talking about these?
Which
You
is
talk about
yours?
that while I look up the other.
So Clarke, okay, so my take, and I want to hear what Farah says too. So there is a book about Clarke that kind of falls into the Patterson category. It is incredibly comprehensive. And if you want information about a lot of stuff that Clarke did, it is certainly here. It is certainly written from the point of view of a fan. And it is, I mean, I used it. I found it a useful resource. Clarke, there is a lot there to talk about that is not resolved, that would take an incredibly objective, or someone who had no particular preconceptions about Clarke to get to the bottom of. I'll leave it at that.
Yeah.
What I can say is the book I'm about to recommend is not that book.
Okay. So this actually ties into a bigger point. All right. So Clarke is a good example of this, where the kind of person who is going to spend the amount of time required to write a good biography of a science fiction writer is generally going to be a fan of that writer. And this is a problem because even when someone is like Bill Patterson, who, again, no one is ever going to top his knowledge of those archives. He looked at every piece of paper, as far as I know, and no human being is going to do that again. But the book is flawed because he's such a Heinlein apologist, and maybe it was necessary for someone like that to say, I'm going to take over this project. I'm going to devote years of my life to this project because I love this writer. It's going to be very hard to convince someone who is neutral to make that same investment up front. But you kind of need that. You need someone who can look at a writer and not have an agenda going in necessarily, and kind of follow the story where it takes him. That's what happened to me in Campbell. I didn't know much about Campbell before I went in, and the book that you see is what came out of that process.
Can I just say I disagree quite strongly with that premise?
Oh,
I'll come back to it in a second. Okay, so the book that I've listed is Gary Westfall's book on Arthur C. Clarke, from the Modern Masters of Science Fiction series, but it's entirely a literary take. It's not really a biographical take. Okay, so I am a historian, and we don't pick things because we're in love with them. We pick things because they're chewy. Mm-hmm. If Heinlein had been seamlessly perfect, I wouldn't have been in the slightest bit interested. I'd have had nothing to say. So I think that's not true. I think somebody will come along who finds Clarke interestingly chewy.
Well, but I agree. I think this is true of a lot of academic writing. I think it's the exception based on what I've observed in the biographies of science fiction writers that have actually been published.
But I mean, you're quite right. It will have to be somebody who's not necessarily connected, but realistically speaking, that's us. Right. I mean, the point we were making in the green room, we are both significantly younger than the previous critics of the people we chose, significantly younger. In my case, 20 years, in Alex's case, 30 years. We didn't grow up knowing these people. I mean, I do know some people who knew Heinlein, and all women, and they all loved him, by the way. But so we didn't grow up immersed. I mean, the classic take on magazine science fiction is Mike Ashley. And part of the reason I'm so determined that I will write the next book on magazine SF is much of his work is incomprehensible if you didn't grow up reading the magazines. Mm-hmm. Yeah. He takes for granted which stories are popular, whereas when you go back and look at the letters page, they weren't. There were complaints, but because the stories were anthologized, they gained in popularity. And this comes back to canon formation, which I know we're both quite interested in. Things become canon because they're reprinted, not necessarily because they were thought to be great at the time. And as Alec mentions, there are issues over reprints of some of Heinlein's work, which even Jeff Vandermeer has hit. Jeff Vandermeer tried to reprint, I think, All You Zombies, and couldn't get right. So one of the other stories, I can't remember which one. So there's all sorts of issues there, which actually ties into a question from Carrie Johan-Noren, which I'm sure you will read out.
Well, I want to quickly go back to what you said about certain subjects being chewy, which I think is a nice word, because going in, I knew that Campbell was chewy. He was chewy as all get out. And I didn't have to love Campbell to realize this. I kind of knew objectively, this is a great story, and no matter where it takes me. And I think that is this is the attitude you want to see more often from science fiction scholarship. I want people to go in saying, if I look at Clark, if I look at someone like Marion Zimmer Bradley, let's say, this is going to be a book that requires a strong stomach and a fairly objective eye, and that's the kind of person I want to see tackling those subjects.
Yeah. Okay, two nice questions in. One from Juan San Miguel. Should we still call it the Golden Age? Should we perhaps call it the Pulp Age, or the Pulp Wave, or the First Wave?
Well,
and the other
first. Can I just answer that one quickly? Oh, sorry.
Okay, do this one quickly.
That one's quite quick. First of all, it isn't the first wave. It's at least the third. And it's the second wave of the science fiction magazines, not the first. I called it the consolidation period. And a very good one. There's a book by Isaiah Berlin, a history book, actually about the Caribbean, that thinks in terms of colonization. Let me get this right. Creolization and establishment. And you can think of it as the creolization period. And Alec talks about this as well. It's the period in which people who grew up reading science fiction start writing it. And it's that shift. So
yes, the Golden Age is sort of a chronological marker. And it was one that was imposed on that age by people who became famous enough at the right time to think fondly on the books that they read growing up, or that they were writing when they first emerged as writers. So, I mean, I use it, it's in the title of my book. And, I'm very aware that it feels like a value judgment. And I always make it clear that, this is the label that has been assigned to it retroactively. And I use it because, that's kind of what that's the name that has been, for better or worse, assigned to this period.
The other thing that Clute terms it is first fandom, and I know that's a thing as well, and the first age of first science fiction, because it does have some things golden about it, but it's not the fiction itself. It's everybody can read all the fiction. It's a relatively small people having the argument, even if that excludes other people. Okay, so there's a cohesion to it that starts breaking down by the 50s. So in that sense, it's a golden age, but all golden ages have their dark and smelly sides.
Nice question in, how do you think Heinlein and Campbell would react to the current pandemic?
I don't want to talk about that, mostly because with Campbell, you never know. I mean, Campbell, maybe I'll let Farah speak to Heinlein. Campbell was a contrarian and to a fault, and in ways that I think were irresponsible and sometimes dangerous. And it would not surprise me if he were, I mean, I always ask, would so-and-so be a Trump supporter? And, I'm not going to even go there. But Campbell, you never know. Campbell could well have come up with a very, what he saw as kind of a heterodox, challenging, the conventional wisdom reading on the pandemic that would have probably been dangerous.
And I'm just not sure about Heinlein. The comment I make in the end is Heinlein's problem is that he made choices based on the information he had, but never stopped to think whether he had it all. And he actually, this is where I think H. Bruce Franklin is spot on, because I think Heinlein fits the profile of elderly people who become absorbed into the Fox world. I'm not saying he would have done, but I am saying that he fits that profile of somebody who would have narrowed down his inputs. And I cannot tell whether he'd have swallowed the guff about Hillary's emails enough to vote for Trump, or whether he would have been horrified enough by the religious right to have voted against. And it could have honestly gone either way.
Yeah, indeed. Back to the books, question from Bob Devney. He says, my impression is that Farah's book delves more into individual stories, and I guess he means individual science fiction stories than Alex. What are the pros and cons of doing that? And to what extent do you feel it was right for the book you were writing, or maybe you wish you'd had time to do it a little bit the
As,
other way?
as I said, it was commissioned for a very specific series, so it was always intended to be a literary book, which is ironic because all my training's in history. But the historical approach meant that I treated the books as the texts as texts rather than as fiction, I suppose. And by that, I don't mean I took them at face value, but I analysed them exactly the same way as I would a letter or the same way as I would a speech. The prose was the sheer joy of really getting to grips with the shifts in Heinlein's rhetoric, which I truly found fascinating, and the way he constructed it. The cons is that cutting it was a nightmare. When you're cutting a history book, which I have done, you can often decide, oh, great, I can take this chapter and it can be an article.
Yeah.
When you're cutting something like this, every time I tried to cut something, something else became unbalanced. And that was really tricky. And the other problem was, let's be really clear, some of Heinlein's ideas horrify us. Farnham's freehold, if he'd have stopped after Joseph's speech about being a black man in Alabama, we'd be hailing it as an anti-racist classic. Instead, it's a shit show. So having to handle things like that and explain what was going on without it becoming an apologia for him was really quite complex. And I think one of the trickiest things was I was writing a book in which I was responding to a low-grade level of problematic criticism that was itself based on criticism. So when you look at the fan sites, there's an awful lot of second-hand knowledge being recycled. And the trickiest thing, I think, was within each thing responding. Can I just say, though, if you want a book by book analysis, the Thomas Clareson book that came out just before mine is the one you want. And it just focuses on the novels. It was actually written many, many years ago and was finished by his friend Joe Sanders. So there are two Joe Sanders, but Joseph Sanders. Mine is not like that. Mine goes around in spirals, constantly looking at the links. So I'd say the other con is I never read, apart from one or two books, I never really pause just to talk about a book. The exceptions are Farnham's Freehold and To Sail Beyond the Sunset, which doesn't really fit anywhere else except at the end.
Yeah. Alec, do you wish you'd written a bit more about the stories?
Yeah, I do. I mean, so the draft of the novel of the book that I delivered was twice the length of the book that was published, and most of what was cut was my analysis of those stories, or a lot of like sort of details that would only make sense to people who were going to take the time to look at the originals. And I do think the book could not have been published at that length. It was already longer. It's in its published form. It's much longer than the book that I had contracted to write. But I do think that there are shortcomings to that approach, because there are a lot of times when I say, oh, this story is a classic, or this story is great, and I don't have time to explain why. And there are a few cases where, the reader has to kind of take it on faith, and say, if you want to read the Rule of Null A, this is a good book to look at. But I have a sentence to describe why this book is worthwhile, and for a lot of these works, that's not enough. So I think the result works, and I made those choices, as I said earlier, deliberately, because there is actually like a lot of great critical writing out there. There are, if you look for it, if you're interested in seeing it, want to read 20 books, you can find that stuff out there now. There was not the biographical side. The historical side was lacking, and you couldn't read 30 books and get this information. So I said, okay, so what's the one place where I can add the most value?
Can I add one more thing?
Yeah.
So I wouldn't always try to write a kind of psychohistory of an author. When I worked on Diana Wynne Jones, I didn't, for example. There are moments when I brought in her past, but mostly not. But this is a book in which I did decide that Heinlein's biography actually was rather important, because you could see him mining it. And I think there are two things, one trivial, but one major, that I really drew attention to that I know nobody else really has, although you pick it up, Alec. One is just how much he talks about kissing, which I found fascinating. All the allegations about the sex in his books, there's no sex, but there is tons of kissing. I think that's an interesting insight there.
Yeah.
And the other is his desperate desire to have a child, because a common comment I've heard is that he's really sexist, when actually he grew up in a period when unmarried men were considered highly suspicious. Adulthood came with having children for both men and women. And to just see that as sexism, I think is quite problematic. But it really shaped the books he wrote later on, where that constitution of family, the focus on having children, is really driving the narrative. And it's just too easy to dismiss that as him thinking that's what women are for. No, that's what he thinks men are for. That's what he thinks humanity is for. So that was an area where I really did draw on his biography quite heavily.
Question from me for each of you. What was the most surprising thing you found in the writing process? Alec,
I'll go. I mean, number one, everything was a surprise, you know, so, you know, there wasn't much about Campbell in you know, that I could rely on in the previous you know, books on the subject, and so everything was a surprise. The biggest one, and I want to kind of get to this because it ties into something else I want to talk about, is so these archives are all out there. I mean, there are boxes and boxes of papers, Syracuse and other places that have been collecting this stuff for years, and you know, some of them haven't been looked at in a long time. And at one point, I was looking at a letter that Heinlein, or sorry, that Campbell had written to a friend of his named Robert Swisher, and he mentions just in passing that he sent a box of his manuscripts to Harvard. And I'd never seen this referenced anywhere before. And I was like, okay, I should probably check on that when I have the time. And so I went to the Harvard University webpage for their library system, and I entered John Campbell's name. And I looked at the first page of results, nothing. Second page of results, nothing. Fourth page, nothing. Sorry, on the fourth page, there was an entry saying John W. Campbell manuscripts. It was a box, and you had to scroll down 4 pages to find it. You had to know that it was there to look for it. So I hired a law student at Harvard Law to go there on my behalf, scan everything, send it back to me. And I found the original draft of Who Goes There, which became the movie The Thing. And the original draft has a massive 40-page opening section that was cut from the published version that no one had seen in decades. No one knew it even existed. So I told Campbell's estate about it. It was published on Kickstarter as Frozen Hell, which was the original title. It's done very well. There's talk about a new Thing movie based on you know, that material, which is, you know, again, it's really cool. It was a side note. It was something that I thought I did. Again, you know, I was talking about this like perfect biographer who comes after me who would say, oh, I should look at this box of books, manuscripts at Harvard. I didn't want that guy to scoop me on anything. And so I looked at that box, which anyone in the world could have looked at in the past like 50 years, and found this incredible thing, kind of just like as a, you know, kind of by the by. But, you know, to me, it's just an incredible example of this stuff is out there. It needs to be looked at because, you know, someone has to do it. And so far, a lot of this stuff is being neglected in ways that I think are really remarkable.
You're really looking at the computer.
Somebody's actually asked, will it be easier in the future to look at modern writers? The answer is actually no, because of course, modern writers don't have those boxes of manuscripts.
Right.
They die, everything's fried on their computer, there are no second drafts. Actually, the most surprising thing for me is the same as it was back when I was in my 20s. So I said this started as an undergraduate dissertation, actually. I was writing on 6 authors, Le Guin, Delaney, Harry Harrison, James Trippi Jr., Marion Zimmer Bradley, and Heinlein. And the only one I wasn't bored with at the end of that was Heinlein. And it doesn't mean I don't still like them, but I was just so fed up of it because I worked on it for 2 years. And the same this time round. Usually by the time you get to the end of a project, you don't want to see it anymore. With Heinlein, there is still that sense of engagement. I mean, I gather, for example, somebody's said somewhere in the comments, I haven't seen the specifics, they've challenged I Will Fear No Evil as really icky. Well, I find it fascinating because if you trace it across all his books, actually it's part of a long conversation about gender, about transitioning, about the physicality of your body, about the nature of consciousness. It's not a standalone for all it looks like it. And it's a long conversation he was having about the nature of love. So every time I think I've exhausted things about Heinlein, there's always another thread. And this comes back to we are a different generation. Why are we attracted to this? It's not, somebody's also said, were all these people a bit of a dick? Does greatness require you to be a dick? I don't think Heinlein was a dick, actually. I think he was an introvert trying to be an extrovert. I think he was profoundly shy. I think he was a man of honor. And I think he did dicky things. That's not quite the same thing. As I said, when I read Alec's book, I was kind of relieved that the Heinlein I'd picked up from his fiction was more or less the same thing that Alec did. And there's a vast difference between a Hubbard, who was a dick, and a Heinlein who did dickish things. Okay, and I've just seen the Farnham's Freehold. Oh, the extreme sexism in Farnham's Freehold. Can I just respond to this one briefly? All the people in Farnham's Freehold that nasty things happen to are all the people who've been horrible to Joseph. One of the things I actually also say in the book is, if in doubt as to who the hero is in a Heinlein book, follow the cat. And it's Joseph who rescues the cat. So whilst I do think the book is a terrible, terrible flop and a disaster in all sorts of ways, that's an issue. And as far as the young woman having sex with an old man is concerned, I married a man 20 years older than me. We've been married 20 years next year. Please take it up with me privately. Okay? I get really fed up about the ageism around this one.
Less controversial question to close with, I suspect. Farah, you've been talking about your book on the magazines as being the book after next. What is the next book? And Alec, what is your next book as well?
Okay, so technically my next book is the one about to come out, which is on fiction about the English Civil War. And to my American friends, yes, we had one, and no taxation without representation comes from it. But the book I'm about to start working on is an English radical children's writer called Geoffrey Trees, who started writing in 1934 and wrote his last book in 1998. He wrote 110 books. That's twice what Heinlein produced. So I've already done my first read through. It'll probably take me about 2 years.
Yeah, a lot of his were shorter.
No comment.
Okay. Alec.
So I'm currently working on a biography of the architectural designer Buckminster Fuller, who was a futurist, best known for geodesic structures like domes. An incredibly fascinating figure who was one of the most famous men in the world during his lifetime, who has faded a bit from the cultural conversation. But if you want to talk about like how America's views of the future were shaped, how he affected the cult of technology in Silicon Valley, it's an immensely rich subject. And it's going to be a bigger book than Astounding. It's been a far more complicated project. I mentioned archives, and knowing that when I start that there are letters and stuff for me to read. Fuller has probably the largest personal archive of any individual, at least in America, and I can only go through a fraction of these letters and scrapbooks and papers, but it's a gold mine. And it's also a book that ideally would take about 5 years to write, that I have about 2.5 years to finish. So it's been a real grind, but it's been very exciting. And I'm hoping to have a draft done by the end of this year for publication sometime in the fall of next year.
Yeah. Well, it's been really exciting to have both of you here and to have created this conversation. I think both of you were really eager to have, and that I was really eager to listen in on. So I'm privileged to have been able to moderate it. That's great. We've had one comment on Twitter from DC in Glasgow, who you certainly know, Farah, and you may know. DC says, "At last, a panel relating to Heinlein and Campbell, which is genuinely interesting." So we've ticked one person's box at least. I want to also thank Bill Higgins, who's been posting books in the Discord chat, which I will now go and hang out in after this. And I particularly want to thank Susan and Alex, who have been wrangling the side things, and anybody else who's there, whose name I didn't get to pick up. And thank you both very much for participating in this excellent conversation.
Yes, it could have gone on for another hour as far as I'm concerned, but thank you. This was great.
And we will continue in Discord in Scioto room even, but I'll get a cup of tea first.
Yeah. All right, thank you.